after we talked, Alexander, and our last kind of discovery call, I was opening your book. I like the way you started the book. I was like, I'm learning about Alexander here. This is
No,
awesome. Adrian Shepherd. I
it's
thought, what a great way to start out the book to disarm people in many
as much
ways,
as it can.
as much as you can. So, talk a little bit about that as we launch into the book, The Unfair Advantage, but also how you started the book off to really start this conversation about.
So to be sure, anybody should be able to engage in the conversation about trans athletes or any other subject for that matter without having to have a friend or know somebody who's trans or anything like that. However, I do think that it strengthens the argument a bit. When, as you say, I'm doing my best to disarm people to make sure that they understand that I'm not coming at this from an angle of hatred or bigotry or anything like that. And I grew up in Brownsville, Texas, and it's a very Hispanic community. One of the few white kids who was around all my Mexican friends and Mexican American friends, and we had friends from Guatemala and everywhere else. But Matamoros is a mile away, so it was growing up there. You learned a lot about Spanish culture, Mexican culture, Guatemalan culture, etc. And then my father moved us to Houston, and we moved into a working class neighborhood. And again, the a big chunk of the folks I grew up with were black, and that's just the way it was. And they treated me good, and I had at no point was I the white friend, and nor was I with my black friends. They were just my friends. I went to a high school that had a huge amount. Houston in general is a massive melting pot and one of the most diverse cities in the entire world. Very large Vietnamese population, very large Chinese population at my high school, and a lot of Jewish kids. So much so, the Biller High School was often referred to, I don't know, still is, as Hebrew High. And again, that's just the way it was. It wasn't something that we thought about in terms of labels with DEI or anything. It was just organic. That's the way it was. But if you have a bunch of friends that are from all different walks of life and you can meander and float between the different communities of jocks and nerds and geeks and stoners and whatever, it gives you a different perspective on life than if you only grew up around one set of people. So I've always been comfortable going to the predominantly Hispanic club or predominantly black club to go out dancing. And the same was true for gay clubs. And that's where I met Adrian Shepherd. Trans woman. This was back in 2005, so long before this became an issue. And we've been friends since. And as I put in that show note, our wedding party photo, she was a maid of honor. You can't come at me and call me a bigot for my position on trans women in sport when I had somebody who was a trans woman in my wedding party, who my wife definitely was fine having her on board, loved her too, but she was my friend. And I was the one who requested that she be there. That was the point of opening the book with that, is to state first and foremost, this is not about hate. Vilification gets us absolutely nowhere on either side of the way. But there's also the truth. And again, when we come back to the idea of inclusion is great for a lot of things, but it is not a universal. There are things that are exclusive. And one of them has to be gender as it relates to sports, because there are significant physiological differences between the genders. So we can get into that next, but that was just a preface.
Yeah, I just really love that you start out with that story. I was like, man, this is awesome. But in much like our previous conversation, this conversation should be a bridge between two extreme sides of a coin for that. And let's just look at the science behind physiology as we roll into this and understand why there is a disadvantage for this when trans women compete with women, biological women. Sports.
Mhm.
So you detail this really well in your book. Highly recommend reading it. But for our listeners, be great to get a baseline here to build the conversation.
We can get into the physiology in a second, but I think initially it's really important to point out just how big the differences are between men and women when it comes to sports. And there's always these misconceptions. Like, I know Serena Williams could beat guys at tennis. That's not the question. If I went to play Serena Williams in tennis, she would slaughter me because I can't play tennis. So that's not the question. But if you take an equivalently ranked woman and put her up against an equivalently ranked man within that sport, 99.9% of the time, the man's going to win, and it's not going to be close. And there are reasons. Now, that does not mean that women's sports are less impressive to watch or any of those things. It's just a simple fact. And so that difference between men and women hovers around 10%, depending on the sport, depending on the characteristics of the athletes within the sport. Is this an endurance event? Is it a power event? Is it a strength event, etc.? But the thing that I showed within the book is to look at the world records in 3 different sports, because these are 3 sports that I participated in, and they are swimming, the track and field, or just running, and then Olympic weightlifting. And the reason I picked those 3, 1, is because I have expertise in all 3. 2, swimming is the arm predominant sport. Running is a leg predominant sport. And then Olympic weightlifting is a full body activity. All the muscles have to be involved in order for you to do it correctly. And then you compare the world records between men and women in each of the different disciplines within those sports. Women tend to be a little bit closer to men when it comes to endurance activities, because they don't require as much muscle mass, which is the big distinguishing characteristic between the two. But even then, men have an advantage when it comes to endurance events. And then if you look at the power events, like Olympic weightlifting, then the difference is really blown out. When we do things that will require large muscle mass and explosive bursts of activity, men, because they're just so much bigger, even if they're the exact same weight in Olympic weightlifting, because men are going to have a different body composition than women, they're going to have an advantage. Now, how does this relate to trans women? When trans women go through a transition in terms of hormone replacement therapy, it will make some changes physiologically for them that will bring them closer to what a woman would be, but not all the way. And some of these things they're just locked in once you go through puberty. And that's the other point that I would see is the other reason I chose all 3 of those sports was because they have age groups that extend from 6 and under all the way through basically end of life. There's 80 and 90 and 100 plus year olds who do track and field and swimming masters and weightlifting masters. I've seen them. There's not a whole lot of them, but they're still there. And so we use that. The differences between boys and girls, and I'm putting that prepubescent pretty close. And in many instances, girls are a little bit ahead of boys when it comes to their physical capabilities to participate in sport, because they develop faster. And that's something that we've all learned a long time ago. But once puberty hits around the 11, 12 age group, it's over. There's no catching up. And so what I put in the book to give some people a sense of, because I can tell you that there's a difference of 10%. And if you're not a sports person, you're like, that doesn't sound like much. So to give some sort of a threshold to look at, a litmus test, this is a really big difference. I put in there a little story about the Tour de France, which I'm sure you read. Yeah. So the Tour de France is a 3-week cycling race that goes circumnavigates the entirety of the French country, in those terrible sense, France. And it's about 2,400 miles in total, and they have 2 days off in total, usually maybe only 1. But it is a race to win that one race, but then there's also additional races within the race, which make it really cool. There's the different stages which you can win, and that's a huge honor in and of itself. Then there's 4 different jerseys that are being competed for. Obviously, the yellow jersey is the overall winner. That's the best cyclist of all within the group. Then you have the white jersey, which is the best young rider under the age of 26. Then you have the polka dot jersey, which is the best climber, and they get points that are awarded for each of the hills that they crest first, or whenever they are down the line. They have to go in reverse order. So first place would be 20 points and down, and then they add them all up. And then there's the green jersey for the best sprinter. And the same thing as they do with mountains, they do with sprints. So they have these little intermediate stages that you race to, and then they give at the finish line, get points for that. So usually what is that the winner is also going to be one of the better climbers. It's the sprinters who are these big cyclists. They're bigger people because they can generate more power, but then they are not very good at climbing. So this last year, the last Tour de France was won by Tadej Pogačar, and he dominated that race, outright dominated. And he intended to dominate. Like every chance he got to attack and make people hurt, he did. And at the opposite end of that, in dead last place, you have Mark Cavendish, who at that age was, I think he was 39 last year, and was racing for one last stage win to become the overall leader in stage wins in the Tour de France. And he got that in the first week. And then for the rest of the race, all he was doing was just hanging on so that he could cross the finish line in Paris, was not in any way trying to compete with Pogačar, not interested. And so you have the distinction between top dog doing everything he can to win by the biggest margin possible, and then dead last place already did what he needed to in the first week, not trying at all. The difference between those two, 7.6%. Okay. So that shows you just how big the difference is between men and women. The smallest difference I saw in track and field world records was around 9.6%, something like that, in the track event. The field events, they changed.
Okay.
That tells you all you need to know. Flojo, very best 100-meter dash runner ever versus Usain Bolt. That's going to be around 9.6% difference. Okay. And you contrast that with first place to dead last place, not trying to win, 7.6%. So these are huge differences that are present. And because we know from some of the science that's already been done, and some of the athletes who have already gone through transition and competed in the women's division, they just dominate. They win. There was one last month. I was actually going to be going to this competition myself to compete, but for reasons we haven't bothered getting to, I did not go to Masters Nationals in San Antonio. But about a week afterwards, there was a trans woman who won all 5 of her events by an enormous margin. It wasn't close. That's simply not fair. And it doesn't do trans women any justice to have headlines like that, because all they do is bring down the people who do, I'm not going to use the H word, are certainly more vitriolic and against them in a personal way than I am.
Yes.
Okay. So with that, we can start getting into the science. But I wanted to make sure that we laid out that distinction between men and women.
Yeah. And I think, and adding to that, if you look at, if the person who doesn't understand, look at Flojo's 200-meter world record. I think it's like 21:34. And you look at Usain Bolt's record, I think it's 19:19, 19:18 or so. That is literally like an Atlantic Ocean sized gap.
It's huge.
In that race, Flojo would not even be in the screen.
She wouldn't be in the final heat. She would make the quarterfinals.
Exactly right. And even when Bolt did that, the record, no one was near him. It was an incredible feat. So that 9.76% or 10% to most people seems, well, that's nothing. If you just think about percentages, it's actually feels like 100%. Like when you look at that. So just to add more to that, but yeah, just definitely jump into the physiology and the science behind it for sure.
Sure. Let's go through and talk about the different elements of it. So if we talk about the cardiovascular component, we measure cardio aerobic fitness with what we call VO2 max. This is the maximum amount of oxygen that your body can consume in a minute. Okay. And so you have different organ systems that are playing a role in this. Obviously, your respiratory system to bring oxygen into the body via the lungs. But then after that's cardiorespiratory, it's cardiovascular. So it's your heart and all of your arteries and veins to transit that oxygen around the body. And the tissue that matters most for sports is muscle. And that's really the only thing we're considering there. So if we make the analogy that the body is like a car, okay, the heart, people say all the time, your heart is your engine. That's not correct at all. The engine is your skeletal muscle. That is what's actually making you move. The heart is more like a fuel pump. It's actually sending nutrients and oxygen to the muscle so that they can use it, burn, and contract, and then they're bringing back the waste products that we make, which we all metabolize after we metabolize our carbohydrates and fats predominantly, and then carbon dioxide we have to get out of the body. So we can look at each of those components and compare them between men and women to see just how big the differences are. And what the limiting factor is for VO2 max is the size of the heart. Okay. And the reason we know this is because as athletes go through training, months and years of training, their heart actually expands in size and gets bigger. It hypertrophies, which is a good thing. But there's also just a physical limitation in terms of the amount of space that's in the chest for it to get any bigger. The heart is surrounded by a sac of dense fibrous connective tissue called the pericardium. And in animal experience, where the pericardium is removed, you could actually expand the heart out a little bit bigger. So that's why we know that the limiting factor for VO2 max is the size of the heart. So when we think about that, men are just bigger than women. They have bigger thoracic cavity. They have more space in which a heart can get larger. The larger the heart, the more blood that it beats with each beat, right? Every beat that it contracts, it pushes out more blood, which means that it requires fewer beats per minute to achieve the same amount of VO2. So there's a limiting factor with which women just can't get past in order to catch up to guys. That's one. Other area where we can get an expansion of VO2 max is if we increase the number of red blood cells that are present in the circulation. So that's what EPO did. So when we talk about doping, the one drug that really changed everything in terms of competition was EPO, certainly within the aerobic end of things. EPO is naturally produced by our kidneys when we have a drop in oxygen levels within the blood. You could have a bleed if you get cut, or the menstrual cycle once a month for women. Or if I go from where I am here in Texas
Right, to
to where you are in Colorado,
Yeah.
and there's less oxygen tension there, my body is going to respond by releasing more EPO to generate more red blood cells. It takes a couple weeks to get there, but that's effectively what you get. Testosterone stimulates the release of EPO. So because men have quite a bit of testosterone and women have some too, but not nearly as much, we have higher levels of red blood cells than do women. Now, if you go through hormone replacement therapy, you're obviously decreasing the amount of testosterone that you have present within your body. It will also drive down your hepatic rate to levels that are close to what women have, but the rest of it doesn't go away. Now, the reason I bring that part up is that there are, as I point out in the book, certain sporting bodies like the NCAA that require a particular testosterone level via hormone replacement therapy. However, for kids that are younger than college age, those requirements are not in place. So you can have high school level kids or even junior high. I haven't seen that documented yet, but it could happen, where the only requirement for transition is effectively what's called a social transition. In other words, the person just says, from this point on, I identify as being a woman, but they're not required to take any hormone replacement therapy. In that instance, those girls are competing against a biological boy, flat out, end of story. When you go through a full transition, and I'm being very careful here, that's physiologically, you're no longer a man because you've changed some of the parameters of your system, but you're also not entirely a woman either. It's something in between physiology. And therein lies where I think you need to have a separate division. Okay, so we can give that part later. Aerobically, we're talking about a difference of around 7 to 10%, depending on the sport and depending on the distance with which you have to run or swim. Okay, the longer the distances, the closer the gap, the narrower the gap between men and women. The shorter the distance, now we're bringing in more power, and that brings in more muscle mass. Okay. So then let's go back to talk about the next thing. Since the engine for exercise is our muscles, having more muscle to a degree is going to make it so that you're going to be faster. Now, there's a strength power to weight ratio that you always have to be within. You're going to be super powerful, but then you got to drag all that extra weight all over the place, which makes it difficult. So if the event is extremely short, more muscle. The longer you go, the more you're dragging that extra weight around, and then it becomes more problematic. So there's obviously a give and take. But because men have bigger hearts, they can actually generate more, they have more oxygen carrying capacity. They're going to outperform on an aerobic level. But then in addition to that, they have more muscle mass, both in their upper girdle and in their legs, to generate more water movement as you're swimming, or more friction on the ground to push behind you as you're running. So power is going to be different between those two. And the problem with the research that has been published thus far to suggest that there's no differences between trans women and women in sports is that they did not use athlete populations to check this. They just used regular old population. So if you have just a couch potato dude who then just turns into a couch potato trans woman, they're not going to have a whole lot of muscle mass relative to an athlete to begin with. So we don't know how well exercise maintains muscle mass as you transition from a man to a trans woman. Those studies haven't been done. But in a case-by-case scenario, when we look at athletes who have gone from competing as a man, they took a year or 2 years off if they're in college or above to undergo hormone replacement therapy, and then they come back through, differences in time are minimal. They're well below the 7.6% standard that we've put forth here. They're just not getting slow. That's a problem.
Yeah, it's a major problem. And what's interesting, I think, and thank you for breaking that down, is I love hearing about VO2 max and erythropoietin, but also all this stuff. I'm like, yep, it's my backyard too for that. But even if you don't know, as a listener, the science behind this, observationally too, this as well. But it's, I think, the area that a lot of the lay people, they don't understand the science. So it's great to break that down. But intuitively, this is pretty common. You've seen this. So one thing you mentioned was about, I may be skipping ahead too far, about this is why it's important to have a separate division or this in between area. Let's look at maybe the argument against that, just to play the other side, is what if there is an argument that this is a very tiny, minute percentage of the population who considers them, who are identifying as trans women, let's just for women for this, will there actually be the viability of there being another division with just people in this category?
It's a good question. And to date, I can't say yes or no yet, but I have some examples for sure. And the examples that I put in the book, as you look at, we already make these distinctions in many other characteristics. Primary one being age. We split things up by age group. You have your bulk of your elite athletes who are going to be your national and Olympic level athletes. They compete against each other. It doesn't matter age. But then when you get into the younger ages, and they go in 2-year brackets typically. And then when you get after college, for those who are not going to go into the elite levels, then you go to masters, and then it's more like a 5-year bracket.
Yeah.
And masters starts, depending on the sport, could be as early as 22 or 25, but somewhere around 30, and it goes on and on. And the total number of people who compete in those final heats or in the meets at all diminishes greatly and as you go up into the higher levels, because there's not as many people who are living until the night. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
But they still go and compete. Even if it's just one old lady or one old dude who's going to be in the final heat, they're running for a world record. They go for it, and the crowds are cheering for them like no other. So we're saying right now, and I've heard the president of the NCAA said this a number of times, we have 200,000 athletes, and right now we have 4 trans athletes. Right now. This is going to continue to
correct.
Those numbers will increase, and we all know it.
We know it for sure.
And that's fine. That's not a problem, but it's also beside the point. The point is, with sports, we want to maintain a level playing field. And what I've clearly demonstrated in the book is that it is not a level playing field between trans women and women. It's not. So for every single person who is able to compete as a trans woman against women, they're displacing one woman for the rightful position in that field. And that's not right. Now, again, I am not vilifying anybody. I'm not calling anybody cheaters. I understand completely their desire to want to be included, and we can incorporate them into the fold. There's no reason we can't. And another point that I put in there on a number of different occasions, I want everyone participating in sports. Even if you hate sports, I want you to participate, because there's value to this that goes beyond the physiology of exercise. There's psychological components, there's community components, there's longevity components of sports that make it worthwhile. And if there's one place where you should have inclusion being one of the most important themes, it's sports. Let's get everybody to participate, but let's maintain the level playing field while also providing a level of dignity for those who are in the trans community.
Most definitely. So let's get to maybe the more, I would say, polarizing aspect, because I think what's important is laying out the science behind this and building the case is what needs to be done. Obviously, this has been very controversial because there's an extreme side on both sides of the equation, or whatever side for that. Why are we having such difficulty bringing people together to have a civil, very factual based conversation like we're having? Is it all just a political aspect of it? Is it a historical aspect of societal issues? What in your mind is causing this to become, honestly, a really gigantic portion of this civil discourse for people?
And again, I want to tread very lightly, but we have to have an honest conversation.
We have to.
I've had numerous conversations with people on both sides of this political divide who are on the extremes. The folks on the right whom I've conversed with, it's difficult to do. There's been a couple pods that I've refused to go on because they're not going to talk about this in the same vein that you are talking about it. Yeah. In other words, they're going to put me in a position where I have to defend trans people against their attacks. And I will, but I'm not interested in having to go down that path.
Yeah.
On the left, you have people who are just refuse to listen to the science. Like I wrote in my book, the unfortunate confrontation I had in confrontation at a conference with a person who was just a true supporter. He just cut me off mid-sentence and said, I don't agree with anything you said. Trans women are women and trans men are men, and that's all there is to it. You can't have a conversation with somebody who's not going to listen or not. And I listened to everything that he brought forth. Again, he brought forth stuff like, I've heard that the science says that there's no difference between men and women. And I told him, these are the 3 papers that they're relying on for that. And one of them is a good paper. The other one is another good paper, but it has nothing to do with sports. And then the third one is a rag that should never have been published. It's remarkably weak data. So you have people who are fighting on the line for identity. If I identify as this, I am this. Now, I don't agree with that position at all, because the only characteristic that we are even debating that about is gender, which biologically, in terms of science is concerned, is truly binary. There is a remarkably small percentage of the population who are intersex, which means that they're born with some level of both reproductive organs present, and that is not the same as being trans at all. No. So you can't conflate those two. So gender, as far as it relates to sex, is truly binary. But we don't talk about this in terms of like race. If you can definitely be a mish of different races and be a spectrum within a single person and effectively identify as whatever you would want to, but that's not socially acceptable for a number of different reasons. And I put this in my book as well, because I was curious. I wanted to see, what does my race actually look like? So I went and took one of those genealogy tests, and it came back, and I knew I had a lot of Spanish in me because my mother's from Venezuela, and I knew I had a lot of BC white in me because my dad is from Scotland. Right. So I'm a first generation American, but I didn't realize that I had around 7% black, and I didn't realize that I had 1% Jewish, which is a small amount. But I focused on the black part. Ostensibly, I could wake up tomorrow and I now identify as a black man. What does that mean? Have I ever lived a single day in this country with the auspices or the long view of slavery and Jim Crow laws? No, I can't make that claim.
Oh.
And so therein lies where I have a difficulty with the identity politics of this specific, is because then it just drowns out everything else in terms of logic. Yeah. Most people who, if we had the same conversation 15 years ago before this became an issue, you wouldn't have to do a study. You would just know that men are bigger, faster, stronger. So it is significant. It's certainly possible that you're not going to be able to accomplish with a year or two or any amount of times worth of hormone replacement therapy, but Mother Nature has has produced over the course of millions of years. That's just not how science works.
Yeah.
So the answer to your question, people have an emotional investment in this. Sports is remarkably important to a number of different people.
That's right.
It is, next to my family, sports and athletics and exercise is the second most important thing in my life, and always will. Before I married my wife and had a kid, it was the most important thing. That's why I've dedicated my entire career to studying it. So there's an emotional investment that goes into this, and it's difficult to make a compromise when people are in an impregnable position of, we are women and that's all there is to it. And the other saying, no, you are not, and that's all there is to it. There has to be some level of compromise. And the only one that's really going to work is to have a separate division.
Yeah. And I agree with that too. And I remember when I first started having some of these conversations, or when I would hear this conversation and people would get so worked up about it on either side. And I remember thinking, I'm certainly for people living how they would like to live. I want them to be free to express themselves they want to be. But even with your eye, you see there's a huge chasm difference in athletics for that. So I always was like, this just seems obvious to me. I don't need to do the research for this. This is so obvious. But becomes really precarious and weird when someone is not even willing to trust their eyes about something. Yes. So you can't trust science, but then you also can't trust your eye. What do you trust then? At that point,
at that point, what you're doing is you're just going on emotion. That's it.
Right. That's it.
Feelings. Now, I'll be the last person in the world to say that feelings don't matter. They do.
Of course.
But I think over the last 5 to 10 years, we've put way too much emphasis on how we feel as opposed to what we're going to do about how we feel. It's great to be a champion of underrepresented folks and to keep them from being
Definitely.
bullied. No question about it. I don't want
100%.
anybody to be bullied. But you get there with the truth. You don't get there with the misrepresentation of the facts. And for the left has always been party of science. You can't only be the party of science when it supports your agenda for the day. You can't then just say, I'm not going to listen to all that science stuff. It's about how I feel and what I identify as. That doesn't work because you have a whole other group of individuals who are there who are being not taken advantage of, but they're certainly losing out. And I'm talking about women. And there's many more of them than there are trans women. And for us as a society to say, all you women, you have no objection. And if you do, you're a bad person. That's simply not fair.
No, it's not fair. And often as human beings, we do this. We make very emotional statements and try to wrap a very twisted logic to support these emotional statements. And we believe that this is very supportive. And if someone tries to tell us something that is opposite of that, we do what happened. No. And one of the most amazing traits of humans is we double down on the thing. We just dive, we go into the hole deeper instead of actually taking it in. And at that point, it's just very difficult to have these conversations, which is why I love that we're having it, because I think it's critical that there is a bridge for this. Because if not, nothing ever happens if there's no bridge to something.
Now, Trump's in office now, and he's put through an executive order that now the NCAA is following, and a number of other sports organizations have come through and done similar things. In other countries, Britain has now, the Supreme Court has defined what a woman means in biological terms.
Yeah.
So now all trans women are banned from women's sports in the UK. But in this country, unless we codify that into law, if a Democrat comes into office as it stands now, they can just reverse that and we'll go right back to where we were before.
Yeah.
We have to come to an agreement on what we're going to do about this. And I think the only thing that we can do is to define women's sports as just for biological women. And we keep talking only about women. And it's because on the men's side, it doesn't impact them the same way.
It doesn't. No.
If a woman goes through and becomes a trans man, they just do not gain nearly as much in terms of their capacity to compete with men at the same level as women do. And so it's not as big a threat on that side. And so that we just don't have as many conversations about that. But I also put that in the book.
Yeah.
Now, to be sure, I am also guilty of getting remarkably frustrated where I'm just like shaking with some of the things that people have said on both sides.
Yeah.
Certainly when it comes to the willful ignorance of individuals to not want to read anything that conflicts with their worldview.
Yes.
Now, I didn't have to go and read that 80-page document that came out of Canada that basically states that trans women should be able to with women because there's no difference, or the 3 papers that they cited as their evidence for that. But I did because it was important to be able to consume what the other side was using as their evidence. And then I went through and categorically refuted each one of the points that they made there pretty clearly. But I have the evidence in that book. When I put the book up online, in terms of an advertisement on Instagram and a couple of the places, you don't get anybody who's just saying, this is interesting, I'll read this, because that's not what anybody thinks in the comments section. The folks on the right are like, yeah, go get them. Good for you.
Yeah.
I hate those people. I'm like, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
I don't want to. And then on the left, one person's, as I say in my advertisement, this requires research and understanding of science. And the comment said, it says we need to do research and then publishes a book with no research in it. You haven't even read it yet. How can you make this statement? But again, that's coming from my side where I would never write anything in black and white without having some information to back up my argument. And if I don't have the information, I don't know. I can't argue that right now. Yeah. That's where I'm coming from. That's a whole other worldview from 80% of the entire population who will throw stuff up anonymously online just because they get away with it. But therein lies where the gap is, and we do need to bring it together. Now, how are we going to do? That's the critical question. I think it comes from people educating themselves on the significant differences between men and women in sports and seeing how limited the decrements are in going from a man to a trans woman through hormone replacement therapy. It just doesn't change nearly enough. And it's never going to. And I don't know that are we in a position where we really want to sit here and tinker with endocrinology, metabolism, urology, all of these different things to completely convert a man into a woman. I don't want to live in that society. That's just not a place I would like to be. I think it makes so much more sense for this group of people who are not women, in as much as they have not gone through female puberty, they don't menstruate, they're not going to get pregnant, they're not going to have a miscarriage, they're not, all these different things that they're never going to experience as women, just like we kids. But they have their own set of unique circumstances and challenges and accomplishments in terms of going through the transition itself, both physiologically and psychologically and socially, that should be honored. We should talk about these things.
Yeah.
They should have their own community, just like women do and just like men do, to talk about what it's like to go through that process. And those are things that I'll never experience. And those are things that women will never experience. And that should be enough to say that you are your own community. And not that we want you to be separate and distinct, but we also want to, we want to celebrate you as well, just like we do men and women.
Most definitely.
Men. Yeah.
Do you think that there is some level of, this is probably going to sound a little controversial, but we got to have these conversations, that sometimes the trans athletes themselves hurt themselves, and they're caused by not understanding this as much and being logical about the differences?
I think, yes. The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
I think that this whole thing could have been handled very differently. I think that there's the potential that the outcome of the 2024 election may have been very different had this not been such an easy,
I agree,
target for the right to go after. And I got to tell you, in many instances, as I was driving around rural Texas right before the election, seeing all the posters that were up on the ranch gates and stuff, they're typically going to be pro-Republican anyway. The vast majority of them. I don't think I've ever seen one that was Democrat, except for maybe Ann Richards in 1988,
that's right,
a long time ago. But the ones that really resonated with me are the ones that said no bulls and girls sports. It's a clever statement, but it's also succinct and to the point.
Yeah.
The TV ad with Kamala Harris speaking to a trans woman about upholding the rights of prisoners to have transition paid for by the federal tax dollar. That's a loser of a place there. Again, I don't care if you want to go and transition. What do I have to pay for?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense to me. So I don't think that the trans community did themselves any favors by the way that they handled it. To just oftenly say, I have now chosen to be a woman. I am now a woman. No, you are not. Physiologically, you are not. You're something different. And different doesn't mean bad.
Right.
So I do think that there has been, because all that they've done is made it so that there has not been any conversation other than lobbing of grenades from either side of the track. We need to have these conversations, which means people have to reach out to me on both sides, and I need to reach out to them. But I'm asking everybody, take the time to read this book. It will teach you a great deal about it. And I will be the first to admit, I have some sharp elbows in there from time to time, but only because it's not because I have anything against the trans community or their advocates, because I can't stand it when people suspend their own logic and just rely on their emotions. That's not a place you want to go when you're dealing with a topic of this magnitude.
Yeah. And that's what's happened on both sides of the equation. It's a very emotional topic, whether one side is very vehemently in lockstep and say, hey, we're going to support these folks, and damn all the other information. Other side, which may be heavily focused potentially on fundamentalist religious values and zero understanding of what it means to be alive and differences in people. And there's a whole treasure trove of discussion on that that. But it's like we struggle to find common sense as human beings and have reasonable it's been forever in a lot of things.
It's a balancing act between common sense and empathy. I very much wanted to get a sense as best I could as to what people go through when they're living in a body that doesn't feel like their own. And I've never experienced that, other than I'm a little fatter around the edges than I'd like to be. I'd like to get rid of it. That's something I can change really quickly.
Sure.
But that's not the same thing as just the foundationally not feeling as though you are the person that you reflected as being in the lead.
That's right.
And I got hundreds of different trans people asking that specific question.
Yeah.
When did you know? What brought you to that point, and what was the journey like to get there? In some instances, it was rather positive the whole way through.
Yeah.
They knew something was quite off, but they had a very open, communicative relationship with their parents and their peers. They lived in an area that was going to be supportive of this, and then they just made a decision to go, and they were happier after it was done. But most of the folks it was a nightmare. To wake up every day and know that you feel like you want to be like that person.
Yeah.
But you look like that person, and there's not a damn thing you can do. It's got to be miserable.
It has to
look
be.
at those circumstances. And that's something you're not going to get a whole lot of folks on the right to admit readily until you sit there and you talk to them about it. And what, think this through. You put yourself in someone else's shoes for just a sec.
Yeah.
Let's use your logic and an emotional stance to say, what would it be like for you if every single day you woke up and you felt like you were living a lie?
Yeah.
I would change it like that.
And people do that though. People do that. They just haven't
the time.
equated it to how many people live a lie every day and they just feel like they're trapped in it. And it has nothing to do with their physiology. Mentally, it's a common occurrence.
You're in the wrong job. You're with the wrong person. You're living in the wrong place. There's a million things that people do. They just stuff it down. I'm not going to do it. Well, that gets you nowhere. That gets you into addiction. It gets you into suicide. It gets you into self-harm. It gets you all these other things. I don't want trans people to be in a position where they have to live another second of their life being somebody that they don't want to be. But you can't take away other people's athletic glory when you have an advantage over them, because physiologically you are that thing that you don't want to be. That's just the way it is.
It is just.
But there's space for you in sports, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm going to advocate for it every step of the way, but it starts with knowledge and understanding. And that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah. Bravo to you. And you mentioned the empathy part. It's hard when, let's say, one side is so empathetic, they can't see the logic. And it's also hard when the other side hates empathy and says it's a weakness. It's like, how can you can't have a discussion if both are so outrageously discussed where it's, dude, seriously? That's insane. Both of this is insane.
So the way that you get to that is you maintain those positions, right? Empathy is everything. And then over here is science and logic or everything. But you put them in your back pocket when you come to the table to start having the conversation. And the other thing that you do is you do more listening than you do talking. And that's a critical element of anybody who's in a leadership role, anybody who's going to be in a teaching role. If I taught little kids for a long time, I taught high school, I was a college professor, I was a swim coach, I was a water polo coach, I coached everything at every level with every age group. And the one thing I can tell you that I benefited for more than anything else was when around the age of 25 or 26, I got to observe one of my coaching heroes doing her job. And when she wanted something to change with that athlete, she would tell them in 2 or 3 sentences, and then she would shut her big mouth and she would listen to what the athlete had to say. And that's exactly what I mimicked that point forward, is I would just sit there and listen and listen and listen. And then consume it all, and then come back with some suggestions thereafter in terms of what we could do to fix this particular problem, whatever it may be. Same thing's going to happen here. These conversations like we're having need to happen, but they need to happen with people who are not as friendly as you and I. But they're probably going to require some sort of mediation to bring together the parties that are warring right now. Because no good is going to come of the way things are right now.
That's right. That's totally right. Speaking of listening, this podcast there's a lot of fitness professionals who listen to it. And obviously they're going to get a lot out of this. But how would you discuss maybe just some fitness professionals who haven't had a lot of interaction with trans athletes or people who are transitioning or going to be their clients and working with them? And they may have questions like, how would this be different for me to work with these individuals with this? How do I approach this? Because I imagine that I've never trained a client who was trans, but I've met increasingly more trans people. And so my observation logically is that this will probably happen at some point, that I will come in contact with someone who I'm going to be training who is trans. So what would be just some high level advice on this? Because this is pretty not tapped in for a lot of people.
And physiologically, I don't think there's going to be a whole lot of difference that you're going to have to worry about. What you will see is that there's going to be trans woman will likely have, they'll be less susceptible to skeletal muscular injuries. Genetically, their collagen fibers are just tougher than our women's. But beyond that, any good coach or personal trainer is going to adapt their training philosophy to meet the needs of their athletes as best they can, certainly with a personal training. Now, if it's team sport, you have limits with how far you can push that. But the best coaches did. The same thing is going to apply here. If you have a person who is already transitioned and you're starting over from scratch, you're just starting with a new person. That's the easy part. The tricky part is going to come when you have someone who is a man, and then while they're in a relationship with you as their trainer or coach, they go through the transitioning process. It's going to require a great deal of patience and a great deal of listening and a great deal of learning and a great deal of adaptation. Adapt or die. That's just the way it is. So I don't give a whole lot of sympathy to coaches who are like, I just don't know what to do with him. Yes, you do. You do the same thing you would do with anybody else that would come into your gym, and you're just going to be establishing a new relationship. That's all there is to it. And if the act of being a personal trainer or a coach is relationship building,
That's exactly
what it is. And so you should be in a position to just sit there and do the same thing you've done every other time before. It's really no different. And so I don't think now, I would be interested in hearing what some trans coaches and trainers say about that, what their perspective is on that.
Me too.
Did your perspective to coaching and personal training change after you went through the transition? How did it change? What's different about that? Those are the kinds of conversations I would love to have, because now we're increasing the smorgasbord of different possibilities there. There's a million different ways to skin a cat. My method of personal training may not be the same as yours, but foundationally about them pretty similar. But all that is going to be reliant on personality and those kinds of things. So that's what I would say is prepare yourself to be open-minded.
Yes.
Welcome the change. Welcome the challenge. That's what sport is all about.
That is what sports is all about.
Baby.
That's right. And I think that's probably will be the biggest hurdle for some colleagues if they are struggling with maybe the societal aspect of it, or maybe their lack of exposure for that, which you could put this in almost anything. I know that I have been the first Black person some white people have ever seen in their life. And so for them, it's different. I remember when I went to Iceland and I was sitting on a bus and this young kid came on the bus. He literally stared at me the entire time. Like I'm talking no break in the eye gaze. He just looked at me and I was an alien from another country. Have you been to Iceland? Obviously, it's extremely monoculture. And so me showing up was like the land first contact. And so it throws people off. So I think in similar ways, when you're working with athletes, obviously, you're adapting, but there's a hurdle that I would imagine of, I don't really know. I've never met someone like this. Like that, I think is a good conversation too, because I think that's what's going to be a big part.
I agree. And I think so on that, I'm going to come at that from two different perspectives, right? The perspective of the kid, right? Who's going to have a ton of questions initially. The first thing I would tell that kid is, hey, people are people. There's really not much difference between us.
Yeah.
Although your skin is black and you haven't seen one of those folks in Iceland before, if you actually sat down and talked to them, people are people.
That's right.
The second thing that I would person from your perspective and say, be patient.
Yep.
And allow for questions to be asked, because the only way we learn the differences between us, not even racial differences, just by individual people, is by asking. And there's so many times where people will just throw up a huff, like, how dare you ask me such a stupid question? Why? Because I'm Black or because I'm a woman?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't have a lot of experience with it. So help me out. I want to understand. So those are the kinds of things coming from a scientific perspective where everything is a question. We question everything all the time. So it's never unusual for me to question somebody or be questioned by somebody, because we all make assumptions, and assumptions are a natural thing that our brain does to categorize people and make life easier. The only problem that I have with people is not so much when they make an assumption initially. When I walk into a room, nobody thinks I'm a PhD. They think I'm a musclehead, and that's fine. And I have no problem with that whatsoever. My problem comes after I've already shown you that I'm not just a musclehead and you keep insisting that I am. Now we're going to have a problem. But that's a different kettle of fish.
Yes.
The vast majority of people, when they're corrected on their assumptions, they accept it and they move on.
That's right.
Interesting. We
That's
can do
right.
the same thing here. We can do the same thing here.
We can do the same thing here. I'm just so glad that we did this, Alexander. And I know that it can be too hot for a lot of podcasts and stuff, but I've never been one of those folks. I want to have the conversation. I want to be upfront and let's just have a conversation. A lot of good things come from listening to each other and having a civil conversation with other people. So thank you for wanting to do this.
No,
I really
absolutely.
appreciate it.
If I may, just reach out to your listeners. If anybody's interested in furthering a conversation or initiating a conversation with me, you can email me at alexander@goodegg.fitness. I will chat online, I'll do it over email, however you want to talk on any subject. Just don't come in with preconceived notions and don't come in with a bunch of hate. We'll talk about it. And obviously, I encourage everybody to grab a copy of my book on Amazon.
Of course. Yeah.
An
It's
Unfair
good.
Advantage.
Unfair Advantage is really good, just like the rest of Alexander's books that the other two that I read, which were excellent. And yeah, really good stuff. And it's been nice just getting to know you. Awesome.
Absolutely. And one of these days, we got to get together for.
I know.
You're
You're like a regular on my show.
my third time.
I know. It's the trifecta here. It was the hat trick going on. Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to get this out there. Seriously.
I appreciate it. We'll talk again soon.
You got it.